Hey everybody, Matt Johnston here, Matt the Lawyer, and we are talking about reasonable accommodations in this video. So before we begin talking about reasonable accommodations, please take a moment to click the subscribe button that you see somewhere down there below this video. And if you want to get a notification when we have put up new content, be sure you click that little bell that's right next to it and you'll get a notification. So the past couple of videos I've been talking about medical and religious exceptions or accommodations requests for employees who have not gotten or will not be getting a COVID-19 vaccine. As a reminder, employers can require individuals coming back into the office to get a COVID-19 vaccine is a condition of coming back into the office. But you have to have this exception for medical and sincerely held religious beliefs that obviate against getting a COVID-19 vaccine. And I've talked about reasonable accommodations, and most of you are probably going, okay, Matt, what the hell is a reasonable accommodation? A reasonable accommodation is some sort of modification that has been discussed and mutually arrived at by the employer and the employee to figure out a way that does not impose an undue hardship on either party and allows the employee to continue to work. So an undue hardship could involve everything from a financial hardship. It could also include staffing hardships. If an employee is a key employee and they need to physically be in the office, then you have to come up with some sort of arrangement that doesn't impose on either the employer or the employee some undue hardship about the accommodation. So some of the accommodations that are available would include things like teleworking, would include a separate office, a separate work area, could include requiring the employee to wear masks or other employees to wear masks. It could involve physical barriers such as plexiglass, things like this. So there's a whole host of possibilities, and I'm going to link to a resource that you see down below that will give you some ideas about different kinds of accommodations that may be available. It's available from a nonprofit organization called the Job Accommodation Network and their website. It's a fantastic resource for small business owners who are dealing with requests for accommodations. So when you are working with the idea of an accommodation, the first thing that you want to do is you want to have a discussion, an interactive dialogue with the employee in question. So that should discuss what is the nature of the objection, what is the nature of the accommodation, what are some options. You can ask the employee what kind of accommodation they would like, but an employer is under no obligation whatsoever to simply accept the employee's preferred accommodation. So let me say that again. An employee's preferred accommodation is not one that employers must accept. So what would be some of the accommodations? If I were a betting man, the most common accommodation that you're going to run into is the ability to telework. Can I telework? Teleworking is an option, but it is not the only option. For certain kinds of objections, such as skeptical, sketchy, not quite sure if it's real kind of accommodation that could come up in a religious context, if you're worried about it, an accommodation could involve a leave without pay. Now, I don't recommend you do that without consulting counsel first. The EEOC, state discrimination offices and things like that, they're not going to be too keen on this idea of leave without pay. But it's a quick way to find out if somebody's serious about their religious objections. But just because somebody says, well, from a medical perspective, I can't have the vaccine, you can say, okay, but you're a key employee and we need you to be in the office. Well, I want to telework. Well, why don't we try this? Why don't we put you in a separate office? Why don't we say, okay, we're going to move Bob out of the office over there so that you can work in there. And anybody who comes in to see you has to put on a mask. And if you leave your office, you have to put on a mask. and we'll put an air purifier in there, or these kinds of accommodations. All of that is a dialogue. And so just because an employee's preferred accommodation is to work from home doesn't mean you have to grant it. So how does the dialogue go? Well, the dialogue should go, and it's usually going to be initiated by a statement that says, I can't get the vaccine. And you can ask why. Oh, it's medical, or I have a religious objection. And it is perfectly reasonable to have a dialogue with these individuals in a confidential setting, in a confidential manner, to figure out what is a reasonable accommodation. Okay? The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and many other state level disabilities accommodation acts requires that employees offer an available accommodation if that accommodation does not pose an undue hardship, significant difficulty, or expense on the employer. Okay? Employers should consider all options. So it could be anything, all options, before denying an accommodation request. And let's be clear, you do not have to grant an accommodation request. But if you are going to deny it, you better have engaged in an interactive dialogue. You better have had a well-documented discussion. And please, please, please make sure you have accommodated or at least consulted with your local counsel, legal counsel, to make sure that what you are doing is going to be upheld. If you fail to acknowledge a medical or religious accommodation request, you could be looking at a very significant investigation, and you're going to be paying your lawyers a lot more to get you out of that problem than you would have paid to have the lawyers do a review before you get involved. So the employers can rely on EEOC guidance. You can rely on OSHA guidance. You can rely on CDC recommendations. You can rely upon information available through the Job Accommodation Network. You can look outside of the bounds of where you are in order to assess an accommodation. So go through the interactive process. Document that process as detailed as possible. Consult with counsel before you make a decision and before you implement an accommodation. And one last thing. It is illegal under a whole wide variety of laws, but certainly under the ADA and other EEOC level laws, it is unlawful for an employer to disclose that an employee is receiving a reasonable accommodation, or to retaliate against an employee seeking an accommodation. So don't do that. Don't disclose why somebody got an accommodation, or even what that accommodation is, and don't retaliate against an employee who's asking for the accommodation. But be mindful, employers, you are not required to accept the employee's preferred accommodation, and you are not required to provide an accommodation if it poses an undue hardship. That's financial, other resources, operational, or if it is going to cost too much. So you can deny it, you can do something different, but you have to keep it confidential. In the next video, we're going to talk about some of the strange things that may start happening when you have to start dealing with accommodation requests. In the meantime, if you'd like to subscribe to the channel, click that little button that you see right there. Other content can be found at this little button. And in the meantime, go out and watch some live soccer. We'll talk to you all later. Bye.